recorded, and this recording will go out to everyone who's registered here and to our other channels. So there's a lot of great information here. You're going to see it and go, oh, so-and-so needs to see that. You'll be able to send this out afterwards. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Nicholas. Thank you so much for being here. If you have any questions or issues, please feel free to reach out to me in the chat. Thanks, Nicholas.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Adam. Like Adam said, I'm from Montana Department of Labor and Industry. I'm an economist in data and operations, and a lot of what we're tasked with is understanding trends in the labor market and helping to inform both our job service, but also the public in general. So if you have any questions on any of the information provided, we are a resource to all Montanans that you can reach out directly to me, and I will put together, even data on your local labor market and information. So with that, we'll get right into the presentation. And I like to start off with this chart because what this really says is it could be worse. When we compare our job or employment loss to previous recessions, we really regained our employment really quickly. And so what this chart is employment indexed to the pre-recession peak. It's basically what percent of that pre-recession peak are we at now. And so once we reach 100%, we're back to where we were. And so what we can see here is in that green line, that is the 2009 recession, and we lost 6% of our total employment, and it took us 2 years to do it. So there's a long economic deterioration, and a lot of economists look at that and say we didn't have enough of a response. So when in terms of stimulus, and so when we look at the pandemic recession, we lost 8% of that employment in 1 month due to those shutdowns that were in some ways self-imposed to reduce the spread of the virus, but it took us only 1 year to recover that employment. So really that recovery, that means Montanans are doing a lot, or didn't have a significant long period of time of unemployment where they had economic difficulty, and so that's a really good thing. When we look at Montana's GDP growth year over year, it's been really high in 2021. And if you're unfamiliar with what GDP is, that is the market value of total production of goods and services in Montana's economy. And when we put it in real terms, that's just adjusting for changes in prices to put it all in an apples to apples comparison. So did we actually grow the goods and services that we produce? And so when we look in prior years, we kind of hovered between 1.5% and 4% in terms of year over year growth in our GDP. But in 2021, we had growth of 6.7%. And a lot of that is due to that increased stimulus, keeping businesses from going out of business, putting money into people's pockets that stimulated that consumer demand and demand for goods and services. So when we compare Montana to other states, we ranked 7th for GDP growth. When you look at us compared to the US in general, our GDP did not drop as significantly in 2020, and it increased more so in 2021. So Montana is better off than the US in general. And like I said, with our employment growth, we had really rapid employment growth. When we look at this, this is again the percent change in employment year over year, and we're comparing to the US as well. And so what we can see is our average from 2011 to 2019 was 1.3% growth, which is about 6,500 jobs per year added. So that's coming in an expansion period after the Great Recession. And what we had this last year is 3.8% growth in 2021. So a growth of about 19,600 jobs. That's partially because we're coming out of that hole. But again, when we compare to the US, we lost less of our employment in 2020. So, and we gained more employment. So we're growing faster than the rest of the US. So again, things are in Montana doing pretty well relative to a lot of the rest of the US. When we look across Montana's regions, we see that employment, this is looking at employment growth from June of 2021 into 2022, as well as growth in the average payroll wage in real terms from 2020 to 2021. And so what we can see in the blue bars is that we've had employment growth in every region of the state, in particular in places where we have a lot of population growth. We've had stronger growth because there's an influx of population increasing employment. So, but some of that employment growth is also just drawing people out of unemployment. So when we look at our eastern and north central, more rural regions, we have a greater, or we have employment growth in those regions as well, but it's less population driven, whereas in the rest of the state, there's a lot more population growth. So that's great that a lot of people are getting back to work, but when we look at the average wage growth in real terms in the from 2020 to 2021, we had wage growth across the state of 1.2%. So when we say that, that's really wages are growing faster than prices in that year. And that's good because people can purchase more with that wage. But when we look across regions, it's really sort of mixed in terms of we have more real wage growth in Northwest and Southwest. And in every other place, there's actually been a decline in the average wage. So a decline in the purchasing power of that average wage. Employment across our Montana's reservations has been, for the most part, hasn't recovered into June of 2020. When we look at that, that this is again indexed to our 2019 level. Most of our, compared to Montana, most of our reservations have had lower employment growth and have not recovered to their pre-recession level. The one exception to that is the Flathead Reservation, which has grown by 8% compared to 2019. And that's largely driven by that increase in population as that area of the state is growing really rapidly. So when we look across industries, how that employment growth is distributed, most industries have recovered their pre-recession level of employment. Some are still slightly below it. But I wanted to just focus on a few industries here, partially because the graph just gets really busy if I include everybody. But I wanted to focus on industries that are more tied to nonprofits or have some share in the nonprofit sector. So when we look at education, nonprofits make up about 10% of employment in that sector. And, it's a sector that includes a lot of the, common sense things like college, elementary and secondary education and education support services. And it really struggled to regain footing in 2020, but after vaccinations and after, return to in-person learning, it's grown and is 13% higher than it was in February of 2020. When we look at healthcare and social assistance, that's one of Montana's biggest industries, and 54% of it is in nonprofits. So it's a big industry in terms of nonprofits, and it includes, hospitals, physicians' offices, nursing homes, as well as community food and housing and daycares. And so what we've seen with that is it took a little bit longer to recover. It's only 2% higher than it was in February of 2020. And that's significant because it was an industry that was projected to grow quite a bit, and it hasn't grown by quite as much as a lot of other industries. So that indicates that this industry is having a little bit a tougher time potentially recruiting. When we look at other services, this is an industry that includes a sort of hodgepodge of different businesses, such as mechanics, laundry services, funeral homes. It also includes other businesses that are probably more relevant to the nonprofit space, such as religious and civic organizations. And what we see is it's still 1% lower than it was in February of 2020. So it still is close to recovery, but hasn't quite recovered. And I don't have a good explanation for why that is, other than potentially it's having a tough time competing with the wage growth in other industries, and that could be affecting recruiting as well. When we look at arts and recreation, it's also been, an industry that was more affected at the beginning of the pandemic because it's a lot more in-person, face-to-face interaction. And so it saw nearly 50% of its employment lost in April 2020, and it took a while to regain that into late 2021. So that's an industry that includes a number of different performing arts, spectator sports, museums, as well as historical sites. So that could be due to a decrease in or change in consumer behavior, being less likely to go to those events, and so potentially less demand for those workers. But I think also it's just another story of having a difficult time to recruit when wages are increasing. So when we look at payroll employment, the previous data that I just showed you was payroll employment, but this is from a different data source. That's a census of employment versus a survey was what the previous one was. And so what this allows us to do is we can break it down a little bit by nonprofit status by matching to IRS records. And so what we can see is for our nonprofit sector, when we look at this census of employers and their employment, we see that the nonprofit sector in 2019 had employment of 50,142, and that nonprofit has tended to make up about 10% of payroll employment. So those gray bars, that's the level of employment. The lines are again indexed to 2019. So have we reached the pre-pandemic level? In 2020, both nonprofits and for-profits lost 3% of their employment, but for-profits have since recovered to 102%, whereas nonprofits are still at 99% of their pre-pandemic level. So still having difficulty recovering. And when we look at some of our average wage data in a future slide, we'll see maybe why that might be. So we're going to talk a little bit about wages and wage growth, but before that, I wanted to talk about inflation, because when we talk about real wages, we're trying to adjust wages based on these changes in prices. So putting it into apples to apples comparison. And what the CP or the consumer price index is really a measure of a basket of goods that is meant to reflect what the average consumer consumes. And the change in that price of that basket of goods over time. So then we break it down into different items such as energy, that would be including those gas prices. So when we see that from June of 2021 to June of 2022, energy prices increased by more than 40%. Most of that is driven by those increases in gas prices, but we also had increases in other energy prices as well. We also had supply of vehicles constrained. So when we see increases in costs of transportation, well, that's partially due to, the constraint of those types of things. And then when we look across all items, we have a growth in prices for all items of close to, I think it was 8.5%. This is data when we compare to our hourly wages there in that bottom bar. It's more recent data than what I've showed you. And so what we can say here is this actually comes from the current employment statistics, and that's the average growth or the growth in average hourly earnings. And so average hourly earnings have grown less than prices overall. And so that's something that people can't purchase as much as they used to. And there's a few different ways that this could be nuanced for Montanans as well. When we look at housing prices, when we look at housing in the current price index or consumer price index, housing only includes rental costs, and we know that housing prices in Montana are increasing substantially. So that's one way that this is national data. It doesn't reflect those changes that are more local. And it also, Montanans tend to consume differently than other consumers. We actually drive more, and so cost of gas prices could be something that's affecting us more as well. So again, looking at that quarterly census of employment and wages and what the average wage has been over the past years, we have seen an increase in 2020 and in 2021. Part of the nuance to that is that in 2020, we had layoffs of lower wage workers, so that would increase the average price or the average wage that people make. But in total, and when we look at total wages as well, total wages have increased in 2020 and 2021 as well. So it's not just due to the change in the composition, it's also due to wage growth. What we see in the green line, that's real wage growth as a percent change from the previous year. So again, trying to put that into an apples to apples comparison of what you can purchase with those wages. We see in 2020, we had a really significant increase that was over 6% in that average wage and what it could purchase, or in wages that was beyond the change in prices. When we look at 2021, we still, we hired back a lot of workers, we recovered our employment, but we still had, average wage growth of about 1.2% that was greater than the increase in wages. So in 2021, at least, our payroll wages indicate that people were better off, but in that more recent data, there potentially that inflation continues to eat into those wages. So what's hidden in the average is that there's differences in the distribution of those gains. This chart shows the average wage adjusted for inflation to 2021 dollars between nonprofits and the for-profit sector. And so what we can see is the nonprofit sector actually tends to make a higher average wage than the for-profit sector across time. And they had a significant increase in average wages in 2021. But when we look at in real terms, the change in average wage to from 2020 to 2021, we actually had a decrease. So a decrease of about $700. Whereas for the for-profit sector, we've had a continued increase in real wages into 2021. So this chart is just putting that in comparison to the average level, indexing it again to 2019 and how much have we grown since 2019. And what we can see is for the nonprofit sector, we've grown by 13%. Those average wages have grown by 13%. So that's, still something to be excited about, though it may indicate that, when we see the for-profit sector growing by 15% compared to 2019, those average wages are growing faster. Potentially that could be an issue for recruiting in the nonprofit sector if they're unable to keep up with the wage gains in the for-profit. So pivoting now to talk a little bit more in depth about the worker shortage. As many of you know firsthand, we're dealing with a shortage in Montana as we are nationwide. And that is mainly driven by retirements. What we have is the baby boomers who make up a large share of the population. They started entering retirement in 2011. So as we have an aging population and more people in retirement, we have fewer people in their working years. And what that means is when we look at when we think of any shortage, we think about a supply side and a demand side. So from the demand side, we have the population, and the population continues to grow. And this is not really an official population measure. This is one that I use. I use the local area unemployment statistics to infer the population growth that they're estimating. But even when we look at the census from 2020 to 2021, there continues to be population growth that's actually kind of in line with this, about 20,000 more Montanans compared to 2020. So we have population growth. All of us contribute to demand, and that means demand for workers. But we also have growth in our labor force and in our employment. Our labor force is those people who are employed or those who are unemployed and actively looking for work. So they had to have looked for work recently and indicate that they're available. And what we see there is that blue line includes the black line, but the difference between the two would be those unemployed workers who are not attached to an employer. And so from an employer's perspective, that is why it's so difficult, is that those lines are converging. There's very few available workers and employers will have to compete workers away from other employers. But for both of those measures, they're both above pre-pandemic levels. We have a labor force that's 20,000 more people than we had prior to the pandemic. We have employment, 24,000 people greater than pre-pandemic, but we also have more people. So we have the population that's growing faster than the labor force, which means we have more people who are outside the labor force. So I talked about those available workers, and one metric that gets a lot of focus is those who are the unemployment rate. That's the share of the labor force who are those available workers. So when we see an unemployment rate that hits record lows, that just means we have a very small share of that labor force that's not attached to an employer, and points again to the fact that we are experiencing something that is historically unprecedented. We've never had an unemployment rate this low in Montana.
Nicholas, we had a question in the chat about, and this may fit or may not, but is the difference in the nonprofit decrease versus the for-profit sector decrease in restoration of employment, I guess, from pre-COVID to now? Is that because of the work that we do, or is there something else that may have impacted the nonprofit sector? Do you have any insight as to why the nonprofit sector isn't fully returned to pre-employment or pre-pandemic employment figures?
I think I'd be speculating. I think some of it, when you look at arts and entertainment or other services, I think some of that is probably due to the wage gains in other industries, making it hard for them to compete. That would be my main explanation for that. But I think considering the fact that a lot of nonprofit employment is in the healthcare sector, and that's been a sector that's been, there's been a lot of strain on those workers and a lot of burnout. Potentially that could be another thing that's driving down that employment level in the nonprofit sector. So
great, thank you.
So this chart actually comes from the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey. It's a new survey that's put out by the BLS in the last few years, and what it shows is the number of vacant job openings at the end of each month in Montana, as well as the number of hires, and they also have layoffs and quits. And so what we can see here is that going back to the 2009 recession, we had that drop in those unfilled job openings, but as the economy expands, employers want to hire more workers. At the same time, we have the baby boomers hitting retirement age in 2011. So they're leaving behind those vacancies that there's not enough young people to fill. So at a certain point, those unfilled job openings start to outstrip the hires that are occurring just prior to the pandemic. And that's due to that demographic shift. But what we see post-pandemic is a really elevated level of job openings compared to prior to the pandemic. I think part of that, at least during stages of the pandemic, is due to that influx of money and that influx of the enhanced UI benefits, the Paycheck Protection program, and other programs that injected more money into the economy, and that increases consumer demand, which is what it was intended to do. But it also that increases demand for workers, and at a time where we've already hired back most of the workers that were laid, or all of the workers that were laid off, it's you're scraping the bottom of the barrel at that point, and so we continue to see the number of unfilled job openings remain at about 45,000 jobs. So another thing that's also occurring is we see quits are higher than they were prior to the pandemic. And so we hear a lot about the great resignation of many workers, leaving their jobs to potentially seek opportunities that either pay better or allow for better, non-monetary benefits. And so I think that's what we're seeing there is the number of quits and the number of hires are both higher. So there's just greater turnover in general. And we can also see with layoffs and discharges, that's actually stayed a little bit lower post-pandemic. And so a lot of those employers are potentially trying to hold on to the workers that they do have. In general, across when you compare Montana to other states, we do have higher levels of turnover in general. So we are the 6th highest state in terms of quits and close to the 5th or 4th highest in terms of unfilled job openings and or as a rate compared to employment as well as hires. So relative to our total employment, we have more turnover in general. So this just puts that job openings data into perspective with those available workers, those unemployed people. And so what we can see in the 2009 recession, we had more available workers than we had job openings, and that's why the unemployment rate and the economy took a while to recover, as those workers are having a difficult time becoming reemployed. When we see just prior to the pandemic, we had about 1.4 jobs per person. So we're starting to get to that point where we have more jobs than people. But post-pandemic, we're significantly higher than we were prior to the pandemic. We have almost 3 job openings for every person. So that mismatch is just, significantly different than prior to the pandemic. And so part of this story is, or the main part of the story, I think, is due to what we see here. And this is those who are not in the labor force due to their main activity while not in the labor force. And so we see the orange line is the one that's really increasing, and the only one that's increasing across time is the number of people who are not in the labor force because they're retired. Like I said, in 2011, the baby boomers hit their retirement age, and we've seen the number of people not in the labor force due to retirement increase by 50,000. When we look at other reasons, they remain level despite that increasing population. And so really, when we look at any of these reasons, they're all good reasons for not being in the labor force. And so as from an employer's perspective, you have 2 options: find ways to engage these people who are not in the labor force, or find ways to increase productivity. And that can be through better training, through investing in labor-saving technology, or rethinking the way we look at work. And potentially we don't need to work more, we just need to work smarter. When we look at retirees, that's a group that is actually, a lot of them are interested in coming back, at least according to national surveys. When you look at them, 50% are interested in returning to the workplace under the right conditions. So they're really looking for better work-life balance, the ability to enjoy their retirement, and also get the benefits of work. And they also really want to do meaningful work. So that would be a good group for nonprofits to engage. And I know even, a lot of nonprofits already rely strongly on the volunteer service of retirees, but potentially that could be a group that you could engage in paid positions as well. When we look at those attending school, most of those are younger people. They're making the trade-off between jobs that require very little experience and pay lower wages, or investing in themselves and trying to get into a higher wage job. And so we have 44,000 who are attending school, and that's their main reason for not being in the labor force. And so we could think about ways to engage those workers is internships, things that give them marketable skills or experiences that they can put on their resume, and potentially work-based learning, so opportunities to earn while they learn and get some sort of credential. For those who have an illness or disability, there's 42,000. These, are workers, we could try to accommodate their disabilities. Most of them are struggling with walking and mobility, but potentially remote work could be a solution for those workers as well, is to bring the opportunity to them instead of, if it's especially difficult to commute to a workplace, that could be an opportunity. And there's some resources. We have a vocational rehab program in Montana that I'll talk about a little later. Family care, that breaks down into those parents. Most of those are parents caring for young children. And even prior to the pandemic, we've had issues with our childcare shortage affecting recruitment. But as we have an increase in the population who's retired and aging, that's going to put more of a strain on those younger workers as they care for elderly parents. So a few issues affecting that group. And then we have those in the other category. We don't really know what the reason is. They just didn't fall into any of the other bins. But what I like to use that group as a talking point for other issues that keep people out of the labor force or unable to obtain employment. Some of those include things like transportation, which are a little easier to tackle. In fact, our job service offices have programs to help people get gas cards or tires to get to their workplace. But for other issues, they're a little bit more complex, such as substance use disorder, mental health issues, and having criminal background issues. And so those are all things that need to be addressed in order to try to engage some of those workers. So I said earlier that the population is growing faster than the labor force. And one of the metrics economists use to talk about labor force in context of population growth is the labor force participation rate. And what that is the share of those who are of working age 16 and up who participate in the labor force. They're either employed or actively seeking work. And what we see from the 90s and 2000s is that we kind of hovered between a rate of above 68 to close to 66% participating in the labor force. But once we hit the 2009 recession, we saw this steep drop. And with any recession, we see a drop in that participation rate as people get laid off and they're looking for work and becoming discouraged. They stop looking for work, and that is what exiting the labor force is. And so, but we see that coincided with baby boomers hitting their retirement age. So we never really recovered back to our previous levels, and we continue to trend downward because of that increase in the population in their retirement years. When we look at that trend, we're really not far off trend, even though we're still lower than we were prior to the pandemic. When we look at participation rates by age group, none of the participation rates by age group are really changing that drastically. In fact, some of them are higher than they used to be. When we look at those who are in their prime working years, 25 to 54, 85% of them participate, which is why they're called their prime working years. But when we look at some of our other groups, we've actually seen an increase. For those who are under 25, there's been an increasing participation rate from 2015 onward. And so that could be due to the fact that a lot of those lower wage jobs are seeing wage increases during that time period, and that's drawing more of those younger people into the workplace. When we get into the 55 to 64 age group, some of those workers are now experiencing disabilities that take them out of the labor force. Some are retiring early. So potentially to get people or to accommodate those disabilities and engage those workers might involve accommodating those disabilities as well. Those 65 and up, when we look at some of those, we saw an increase for a little bit after the Great Recession. That's some of those workers coming back to make up for that lost income. But for the most part, they've remained close to 20% of them participating. So what's really happening is there's not really a big shift occurring among an age group in their participation in the labor force. It's really people moving from the 55 to 64 age group into the 65 and up. That's what's driving this. And when we look across the US, just looking at recovery from the pandemic, we've recovered for a lot of our age groups, but across the US, that hasn't quite been the case. Another thing that's in addition to the demographic change that's affecting our availability of labor is absenteeism. And what we've seen is that absenteeism is those people who are employed but were absent in the previous week due to some issue. And so what we've seen is post-pandemic, that continues to remain elevated. The number of people who are absent for any reason in a given week on average is 25,000 people. For some of the main reasons that continue to remain elevated, people might be making up for lost vacation time, even though that's pretty much on the same level as it was prior to the pandemic. There was a dip in 2020, but it is about in line with historic trends. When we look at absence due to other reasons, I think that big hump is really due to those temporary closures. So people are absent due to that reason, but it actually does still remain a little bit elevated. And then the one that really continues to climb a little bit is those who are absent due to illness or medical leave, and that remains elevated. And we'll see that even from other data sources, the number of people who are not working due to COVID has risen as well. And then for those who are absent due to parent obligation and childcare, that actually surprised me a little bit that it didn't grow more in 2020, but potentially parents aren't completely absent from work. We do see that their number of hours that they work decreases. So that might be, they're just finding ways to make it work and just reducing hours. So when we look at COVID cases compared to those who are not working due to caring for someone who's sick or are sick themselves with COVID, that's actually been something that this data comes from a experimental survey from the Census Bureau. It's called the Household Pulse Survey, and they actually send, I've taken this 2 times on my cell phone, so it's kind of an interesting survey that allows a little bit more of that timely data. What's interesting about this is we've seen an increase in the number of people who are not working due to caring for someone or being sick themselves with COVID. And so that's considered not in the labor force. They're not working. They're not necessarily looking for work. And that level has been in line with the number of new COVID cases in each year. When we look at total COVID cases in 2021, that's been 116,000 according to the CDC. And we're on pace to be above that. So the number on the right, or the number of people who are not working due to COVID, that's an average. So that's the average people that are at the time of the survey were not working because of COVID. And then, like I said earlier, we have about 42,000 who are not seeking work due to an illness or disability. So part of that could be, there's been more evidence that long COVID is affecting or increasing those who stay out of the labor force due to illness or disability. But this is all illnesses or disabilities. And so when we look at the main ones that we need to tackle and address, walking and mobility are the 2 biggest ones that if we could remove those barriers, we could potentially have those workers join us. And so when we look at these, some of the services that are provided, DPHHS in Montana has a vocational rehab program, and they offer career counseling, training, as well as they identify and obtain adaptive aids and equipment necessary to help people get or keep a job. So that's one service that employers could look to try to engage more workers with a disability. And so a lot of us are aware that Montana's childcare shortage is something that's really been a drag on our economy and parents' ability to participate in the labor force. When we look at our licensed childcare capacity, this comes from work done by my colleague Amy Watson, and what she estimates is the number of households who have a child under the age of 6 who have one or more of the parents participating in the labor force. And that would be sort of the estimated demand. And when we look at our licensed childcare capacity, we're only meeting 47% of that estimated demand. We did a separate survey of Montana businesses and found that half of Montana businesses in every region of the state say over half of Montana businesses in every region of the state say it's affected their recruitment. And so that's another 35,000 Montanans we could potentially help to be able to work. In addition, inconsistency in childcare through the pandemic has likely led to parents working fewer hours. We continue to see parents work about 2 hours less per week than prior to the pandemic, which doesn't sound, all that significant, but it does equate to about 9,600 fewer full-time employees in Montana than we had pre-pandemic. So looking at that distribution across the state of that licensed childcare capacity meeting demand, there's some states that do, or some counties that do better than others. For example, Missoula is the highest with 66% of estimated demand being met. Cascade's got 64%. But really in the western side, we're doing a lot better than a lot of the rural areas in Montana. And so it's exciting that there are some areas such as Fallon County that are looking into increasing childcare access through childcare and community center. And so that could be something that employers could take part in and try to help make happen, because that'll increase parents' ability to participate and participate consistently. And then one other issue that I wanted to touch on just briefly is the increase in home prices that we're seeing across the state, and the increase in housing prices. And when we look at a slide that shows some of the most significant challenges for workers, housing is the most significant challenge that our job service workers cite. So when we look across Montana compared to 2015, the median home price has increased by 154%. And so that's a really significant increase. And we can see a lot of the counties that we know are having a real difficulty with housing are increasing at a faster rate than that. And that's partially due, again, we had population growth from 2010 to 2020. That was it increased by 10%, whereas our housing units only increased by 7%. So that's a supply side issue, or supply not being able to keep up with demand. So looking at some of the main challenges for workers, we just talked about affordability of housing, and I know some of you nonprofits are working on making that housing more, or increasing the availability of affordable housing. So keep up the good work. That is a significant challenge, and if workers can't afford to live in the areas that there are jobs, then we're just not going to have access to them. But another thing that could potentially be a solution to the housing issue is more remote work. Maybe I don't need to recruit a worker in Gallatin County. Maybe I can recruit them from somewhere where housing is a little bit cheaper. Affordability of daycare. We've talked about 51% of our job service workers cite that as an extreme challenge. And so another thing that needs to be addressed. Low pay at available jobs, of course, affects the affordability of housing and daycare and of everything. And so increasing pay could be, another thing that employers need to look at, though I know that it's not always possible to do that. And then when employers are looking at recruiting and whether they're not getting enough applicants for job postings, they might need to look at the job posting altogether, and the job posting process is maybe too arduous in a time where people don't really have the time to spend an entire day filling out an application. So trying to streamline those processes a little bit and increase your application pool. I also think non-monetary benefits are another thing that employers can consider if they can't increase pay. I had one employer that I gave an example of. They simply added that you could take your dog to work on a Friday, and that increased their applicant pool surprisingly. And so that's another thing that employers need to consider, is making it even just more fun and focusing on these company culture aspects. And then another one I want to touch on is having a background issue. When we look at this time where it's actually relatively easy to find a job, and we still have a group of unemployed people who are having difficulty. Especially young men in their 20s and 30s, nearly half of them nationwide have some kind of criminal background issue that makes it difficult for them to find employment. And so Montana Department of Labor and Industry, we partner with Department of Corrections to put on a job fair in the prison. And so that could be something, if you're an employer that's interested in that, could participate in that to try to transition workers out of the prison system straight into a job. And so the main takeaways I hope that you walk away with today is our demand for workers is relatively high. We've had positive economic shock, a big injection of money into Montana's economy, and really rapid growth. Another thing that's contributing to that increased demand for workers is that higher turnover. So employers are having to look for workers more frequently because they're competing workers away from each other. We've also had just that high population growth and growth in those retirements. And so retirees, because they're older, they're going to have more demand for healthcare services. So that's something that's going to change or put more strain on that sector, but it's also increasing as we have population growth, we increase the demand for goods and services in general. When we look at supply of workers, like I said, the aging population is the main thing driving down our supply of labor, and especially relative to that demand, is we have more people contributing to demand, less people contributing to supply. Illness and COVID continue to remain an issue that affect the availability and increase that absenteeism. We had 8,600 people who were absent at any given time during that survey due to COVID. When we look at parents, we continue to see them work reduced hours, about 2 fewer hours per week. So addressing childcare is not only something that could get more parents into the workforce, but could also increase their availability. And then we've had high migration from out of state. So part of that is, if those people are coming here and they're part of the labor force, that is part of that increase in supply that we're seeing and the increase in the labor force that we're seeing. But potentially if they're coming here and they're working a remote job, they're contributing to that demand, but they're not contributing necessarily to the supply of workers locally. And so there's potential competition from those remote employers who may be competing those workers in Montana away from our local employers and by potentially offering a better wage or something of that nature. So that could be another reason why, or another thing that's affecting the supply of workers. So what can we do about it? I think with any of the groups that we talked about today, making it easier and more appealing to work is going to be something that engages more people from those groups. Especially when we looked at those retirees and those parents, better work-life balance is something that's going to increase their likelihood of wanting to take a job in the first place or being able to take a job in the first place. So we can think about making our positions more flexible, increasing remote work opportunities. We can look at trying to tackle bigger issues in our community, such as childcare access and availability of affordable housing. And of course, we can try to increase wages. If it's just become too difficult to try to attract those workers, potentially we need to just provide better training and increase the productivity in the workplace. So potentially that could be through better training, but it could also be through rethinking work and allowing more flexibility. I think the better work-life balance is another thing that increases the amount of work that a person gets done in an hour, is having enough leisure time to really take a break from work. So redesigning the workplace in the way that we think about work. What groups can we target? We talked about those retirees, those with a disability, and parents and students, as well as those with a background issue, which there are ways that you could potentially reach out to those groups that Montana Department of Labor is involved in. So with that, I think I'm 10 minutes early, but if you have any questions on any of this information, you can email me. We also put together a lot of different data dashboards, such as our housing dashboard. We have one on unemployment claimants. We have one on our job openings that are available in different areas. So those are all tools that we put out there to try to help inform the public about their local labor market and trends that are occurring in their local labor market. So if you are interested in any of those or interested in further discussion of any of the things I talked about today, feel free to reach out to me.
Thanks, Nick. We have one question in the chat, and folks, if you have additional questions, please feel free to put those in there. Nick, there's a question just about the impact of hybrid work or work from home, remote work, if you can see any of that in the numbers. And maybe my question is a follow-up to that. If folks are maybe working remotely for out of state somewhere, does that show up in Montana employment typically, or is it, what are your thoughts on that? How can we see the impact of remote work?
It's hard to identify given the way that our data is constructed, but we are actually like the quarterly census of employment and wages is supposed to be adding an identifier for those remote workers. So in the future, we'll be able to identify those. One sort of way that I've tried to identify them is by looking at the number of new employees that come into the state and are brand new this year and are like a single worker entity. And so we've seen an increase in those. And when you look at the industry level that it's happening at, it's custom computer programming. So a lot of these are likely those teleworkers that we hear about, but we still don't have a great estimate for like the total number of teleworkers that are coming to Montana. We just know that it's happening in some form.
Great, thank you. Any other questions, folks? Feel free to put them in the chat if you have them. Otherwise, we'll give you a few minutes of your time back. This was super interesting, and I think it demystifies a lot of kind of the rumors or the things that we hear about what's happening with workforce or people's willingness to work or whatever. It's great to see actual data around the reality.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, Lawrence just had a comment. The demand for development and fundraising talent is especially high, which we've seen. It's doubly hard for organizations trying to enlarge their donor base. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you, Nick. Thank you all for being here. And this recording will go out if you wanted to share this with any of your colleagues. So you'll have this. And yeah, appreciate your time and appreciate your expertise on this, Nick, and all you're doing for the state.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much.
Right.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Yeah. See ya.